Dawn creeps over the mountains of Manchuria, 9th of August 1945. On the ground below, Soviet artillery is already thundering. The opening act of Operation August Storm. High above the dust and smoke, 4 Bell P-63 Kingcobras slice through the thin morning air at 10,000 feet. Allison engines turning a steady, metallic hum into the pilot's headsets. In the lead cockpit, a Soviet flight leader scans the hazy horizon. His canopy is streaked with early light. The gun sight glows faintly in front of him, its circle neatly framing the spinning propeller hub. On the radio, a calm ground controller's voice cuts through the engine noise, vectoring the formation toward bandits, climbing out from a Japanese airfield just across the border. A few miles away, in a cramped cockpit with canvas, straps cutting into his shoulders, a Japanese army pilot hauls his Ki-43 upward toward the sun. He's tired, short on fuel, and flying an airframe older than he is as a combat pilot. But he isn't afraid. The word passed through the squadron days ago. The Soviets are flying American Bell fighters. Clumsy, nose-heavy machines, just like the P-39 that German and Italian pilots mocked years before. Heavy guns, poor climb, slow in the turn. Easy meat for a light, nimble Hayabusa. The first sighting is almost casual. Dark specks crossing against the glare. The Japanese leader snaps into a hard turn, trying to drag the enemy into a horizontal spiral where the Ki-43 can dance, and the heavy Americans will flounder. But the Kingcobras do not follow. Instead, the Soviet leader rolls his P-63 on its side and drops into a slashing dive, trading height for speed. The Ki-43 flashes through his reflector sight for an instant. He feathers the controls, lets the target drift to center, and squeezes the trigger. The Kingcobra shudders once as the 37 mm in its nose booms. A single shell streaks out along the line of flight and finds the Japanese fighter, just as it starts to pull through its turn. There is no drawn-out dogfight, no ballot of circling aircraft, only a sudden eruption of fire where the cockpit used to be. Plexiglass, fabric, and bone vanish in a dirty orange blossom. Japanese pilots had laughed at the Kingcobra. In this abrupt, violent moment, the laughing stops. And yet this is the paradox. The aircraft that just erased a cockpit with one pull of the trigger was one many American officers never wanted on the front line at all. How did a second-rate fighter, dismissed in its homeland, become a ruthless executioner over Manchuria's final battlefields? By the usual yardsticks of aviation folklore, the P-63 Kingcobra should not be the star of any story. It was not the fastest fighter of the war. It did not have the longest range, nor the highest ceiling. On the spec sheets that enthusiasts love to argue over, the Kingcobra sat awkwardly behind the glamour machines behind the P-51 Mustang, behind the BF-109 and FO-190, even behind some late-model Spitfires. And visually, it looked like a compromise. A warmed-over P-39 Kingcobra engine buried behind the cockpit, tricycle landing gear, and an outsized 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. Many Western test pilots and staff officers saw that gun as a gimmick. Too much recoil, too few rounds, too slow firing to be useful in the whirling chaos of a proper dogfight. But the Kingcobra's real power was never in its brochure numbers. It lay in fit, in Soviet hands. The P-63's concentrated nose armament and tough structure meshed almost perfectly with a hard-earned doctrine of low-altitude, energy-based attacks. Those same traits were then brought to bear against an enemy whose fighters, Ki-43's, Ki-27's, even some Zeros, had been deliberately stripped of armor and structural strength in the pursuit of agility. In that specific environment, what American pilots called flaws became brutal advantages. The 37mm turned fleeting encounters into sudden executions. The reinforced airframe and armor absorbed punishment that would have torn a Japanese fighter apart. This video is about that intersection, how an underestimated aircraft, quietly written off by its primary customer, became, for a few violent weeks in 1945, a war-ending weapon in another Air Force's hands. It is a story of contrasts, the glamorous escort fighter versus the workmanlike interceptor, the romantic image of the swirling dogfight versus the cold reality of the one-pass kill. Early war, Japanese mastery versus the vulnerability of a battered air arm facing a new kind of predator. When Bell's engineers first sketched the Kingcobra, it was supposed to be a very different kind of killer. The original XP-39 had been conceived as a high-altitude interceptor, built around a turbocharged Allison engine that would let it claw up to meet incoming bombers. The layout was radical, the engine buried behind the cockpit, a long drive shaft running under the pilot's feet to the propeller, and a heavy cannon firing straight through the hub. On paper, it was futuristic. Clean aerodynamics, concentrated firepower, and a powerful turbo to make it all work. Then, the compromises began. In the late 1930s, under pressure to simplify production and maintenance, the turbocharger was quietly deleted. The airframe was reworked for a single-stage, supercharged Allison. The result was an aircraft that looked like a high-altitude interceptor, but no longer had the lungs for thin air. Above medium altitudes, the P-39 lost its edge. British and American pilots flying early Kingcobras complained of sluggish climb, poor performance above 1520, Zallows feet, and spin characteristics that could turn vicious if mishandled. RAF reports were blunt, interesting, but unsuitable for European, high-altitude fighting. The type was quickly pulled from frontline RAF service and shunted to secondary roles. To many Western eyes, the Kingcobra became a curiosity. That mid-engine layout and drive shaft under the seat felt more like a party trick than an advantage. The big nose gun was impressive, but if you couldn't get to the fight, or stay there, it didn't matter. Yet thousands of miles east, the same machine was fighting a very different war. On the Eastern Front, Soviet pilots flew their Airacobras low, where the Luftwaffe's vaunted high-altitude performance meant little. Here, the P-39's quirks became assets: stable gun platform, concentrated nose armament, strong structure, and decent speed at low and medium heights. Aces like Alexander Pokryshkin quietly amassed dozens of kills in P-39's, while Western magazines still sneered at the type. Bell's chief engineer, Robert J. Woods, and his team paid attention. The next step, the P-63 Kingcobra, would keep what worked: the mid-engine balance, the nose cannon, the basic form, but it would fix what pilots hated. The Kingcobra received a more powerful Allison V-1710, a new laminar flow wing to cut drag, a longer tail, and reworked control surfaces to tame spins, and a strengthened structure. The 37 mm installation was refined for better reliability and handling. On the test range, the improvements were obvious. The P-63 topped 400 miles per hour in level flight, climbed better, and felt more predictable at the edge of the envelope. At last, Bell's radical concept had matured, but by then, the United States Army Air Forces had moved on. With the Mustang and Thunderbolt dominating the strategic picture, there was little appetite for another single-engine fighter that didn't excel at long-range escort. Inside U.S. circles, the P-63 was quietly labeled just another Bell. Useful for training, perhaps, or for allies who couldn't be trusted with the very latest types. That dismissive judgment did not stay secret. Japanese intelligence, poring over scraps of Allied reporting and frontline gossip, absorbed the same tone. The Kingcobra was a second-tier fighter, a footnote, a misfit. They would only discover, too late, how much Bell's misfit had changed. If there is a single feature that defines the Kingcobra, it is the blunt, almost menacing circle at the center of its spinner. That opening is not decorative. It is the muzzle of a 37 mm cannon. Bell's unusual mid-engine layout made this possible. With the Allison V-1710 mounted behind the pilot, a straight drive shaft could run forward, under the seat, to the propeller gearbox in the nose. That left a clear tunnel directly on the aircraft's centerline, perfect for a large gun firing straight ahead. Where most fighters had to cram weapons into the wings or cowl, bending feed chutes around engines and fuel tanks. The P-63 could simply point its biggest gun exactly where the pilot was looking. Chair on screen. Cutaway of P-63 nose, showing drive shaft above the cannon. Ammo drum behind. The weapon itself was a development of the Oldsmobile 37 mm aired aircraft cannon, ANG M4 and later M10 variants. It fired a shell weighing well over half a kilogram at roughly 600 meters per second. Rate of fire was modest, on the order of 150 rounds per minute in theory, far less in practice. And ammunition supply was limited, typically around 50-60 rounds in the Kingcobra's nose drum. Pilots had a choice of ammunition: high explosive shells for aircraft and soft ground targets, and armor piercing for heavier vehicles or hardened points. Against a lightly built fighter, a 37 HE shell was overkill. If it struck a wing root or spar, it could snap the structure like a twig. A hit near the cockpit might blow out the canopy, shatter instruments, and cut control runs in a single blast. A shell reaching a fuel tank could leave nothing but burning fragments in the air. This is what vaporized cockpit really means, not melodrama, but physics. Now set that against what many Japanese Army pilots were flying. Typical early and mid-war types like the Ki-43 or Ki-27 carried a pair of 7.7 mm rifle caliber machine guns, or at best one or two 12.7 mm heavy machine guns. Doctrine expected long bursts, walked carefully onto engines or cockpits to bring an opponent down. Even later, heavier Japanese fighters often remained lightly armed by Western standards, and their airframes were rarely protected by much armor or self-sealing fuel. The Kingcobra, by contrast, concentrated its firepower in the nosy, that 37 mm cannon, backed by 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 2 synchronized in the upper nose and 2 in the wings on most variants. There was no convergence problem to solve for the main weapon, no guessing where wing-mounted streams would cross. If the pilot kept the target in the sight ring and his aim steady, 1 or 2 shells could end the fight. But the big gun was no free gift. The recoil was brutal, kicking the nose up and slightly offline if the pilot held the trigger too long. The slow rate of fire and pronounced shell drop at range punished sloppy shooting. Manuals and instructors emphasized short, controlled bursts at close distances, often under 300 meters, and warned against hosing away the limited ammunition. On screen, excerpt from a P-63 gunnery manual stressing short bursts and close-range fire. He used carelessly. The 37 mm was a clumsy club. Used with discipline, it was a scalpel. In the fragile skies over late war, Manchuria, where many Japanese aircraft had almost no armor at all, its effects were not exaggerated. They were inevitable. By the time the Kingcobra was ready, the United States had already chosen the kind of air war it wanted to fight. In 1943-44, American doctrine revolved around daylight strategic bombing. The priority was simple: get heavy bombers deep into Germany and Japan and get them home again. That meant long-range escort. Fighters that could climb high, cruise far, and still be deadly at 25,000 feet. The P-51 Mustang, with its laminar flow wing and British-derived Merlin engine, was made for that role. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with a huge turbocharged radial, could haul guns and fuel into the stratosphere and dive away from almost anything. The P-63 Kingcobra could not. It was fast and capable, but its Allison engine and design emphasis made it, at heart, a low to medium altitude fighter. Its range on internal fuel was respectable for a tactical aircraft, but inadequate for 8-hour escort missions stretching to Berlin and back. On staff charts, it simply didn't fit the new strategic picture. So in American service, the P-63 was quietly sidelined. Many airframes stayed stateside as advanced trainers. Others were converted into RP-63 pinball aircraft, clad in armor and wired with lights so gunners could fire frangible bullets at them in live fire practice. To the American pilots, who saw them glowing like arcade targets in the pattern, the Kingcobra looked more like a flying experiment than a frontline weapon. In the Soviet Union, the same airframe entered a different universe. Soviet doctrine, forged in the furnace of the Eastern Front, emphasized combat, where most fighting actually occurred low and medium altitudes, close to the front lines. There, what mattered was not an extra 1,000 feet of ceiling, but how quickly you could climb to meet enemy JBOs, how hard you could hit a bomber or column, and whether you could survive the return fire. Bell fighters fit that niche. P-39's and later P-63's were slotted into fighter regiments, tasked with intercepting German attack aircraft, escorting Il-2 Sturmovix, and pouncing on enemy formations near the front. Training schools that specialized in Lend-Lease types built entire syllabi around their strengths: deflection shooting with nose guns, fast slashing attacks, and immediate climbs back to altitude rather than lingering in a turn fight. Instructors drilled one lesson especially hard: do not get dragged into slow, horizontal dogfights, the very arena where early Luftwaffe and, later, Japanese doctrine tried to lure opponents. Use your speed, your dive, your firepower. Attack once, attack hard, then reset. The P-63's rugged construction, cockpit armor, and heavy nose battery made it ideal for this style. It could dive through flak or defensive fire, unleash a short, brutal burst from its 37mm and 50 cals, and then claw back upward on sheer horsepower. Here on screen, excerpt from a Soviet tactical manual for Bell fighters outlining high speed, boom and zoom. Attacks. Cut to a post-war Soviet pilot recalling the kick of the 37, Memin and the need to fire in brief. Aim taps. Aim 2 views of the same aircraft crystallized. In U.S. eyes, the P-63 was a second-rate escort with an awkward big gun. In Soviet eyes, it was close to an ideal low-altitude interceptor and attack fighter. It was that second view that would matter in the skies over Manchuria, before they ever saw a Kingcobra. Japanese pilots thought they understood exactly what it would be. For years, Imperial Japanese Army and Navy doctrine had revolved around a simple creed: maneuverability and pilot skill win battles. Aircraft like the A6M0 and Ki-43 Hayabusa were designed as pure expressions of that belief. Lightweight, highly responsive, stripped of almost anything that added weight, but not lift. Early models had no self-sealing fuel tanks, almost no cockpit armor, and minimal structural redundancy. In 1941 and 1942, this philosophy seemed vindicated. Against undergunned, poorly trained Allied units flying P-40s, Buffaloes, and early Hurricanes, Japanese fighters carved bloody arcs through the skies, cementing the legend of the invincible turning fighter. But legend and reality slowly diverged. As the war ground on, Japan's industrial base faltered. More modern, tougher designs like the Ki-84 Hayate or the N-1K J Shiden struggled to reach the front in real numbers. Fuel shortages bit deep. Training hours for replacement pilots collapsed, where pre-war aviators had hundreds of hours before combat. Late war pilots might have a tenth of that. The average skill level in the cockpit fell, even as the quality of the opposition rose. Intelligence on new American types was uneven and often out of date. Reports of the P-39 Kingcobra had circulated earlier in the war, usually repeating Western criticisms. Poor high-altitude performance, tricky spins, disappointing as a European frontline fighter. To many Japanese officers, Bell fighter became shorthand for an oddball, second-rate machine. When word trickled in via German and neutral sources that the Soviets were receiving an improved P-39 with a larger cannon, it fit neatly into existing prejudices. Heavier, more complex, burdened with a huge gun that must, surely, be slow to fire and hard to aim. Another lumbering American brute for a nimble Ki-43 or 0 to dance around. August 1945 shattered that illusion. When Soviet P-63's crossed into Manchurian airspace, they did not spiral into polite turning duels. They came in fast, climbing hard, using altitude like a weapon. Japanese formations were bounced within sight of their own airfields. One moment in loose climb, the next under attack from above by compact, high-speed fighters that slashed through indisciplined passes. In those first encounters, the psychological impact was immediate. A flash from a Kingcobra's nose, a brief, almost lazy-sounding thump of the 37 mm, and a wingman simply ceased to exist. Cockpit torn open, fuel and fragments blooming into a brief, hideous fireball. There was no prolonged, artful duel. There was only contact, impact, and absence. Pilots who had been raised on the gospel of the turning fight suddenly found themselves in an environment where turning didn't matter. Their light, agile aircraft could not absorb even a single hit from the Kingcobra's nose, cannon. Maneuverability, once their trump card, now only made them more exposed targets in the vertical plane. Post-war accounts from Japanese survivors speak of a new, unwelcome feeling in those final days over Manchuria, a sense, as one might paraphrase it, of being hunted in our own airspace. The contrast could not be sharper's early war confidence, verging on arrogance in the supremacy of agility and courage. Late war dread, as that creed collapsed in the face of a different kind of air combat, defined not by graceful turning circles, but by one pass, decisive blows from a gun they had once laughed at. In August 1945, the Kingcobra finally went to war, for real, and the war it entered was already crumbling beneath it. When Stalin unleashed Operation August Storm, 3 Soviet fronts and multiple air armies surged into Manchuria, northern Korea, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. Among the massive Yakovlevs, Lavochkins, and Il-2 Sturmoviks were several fighter regiments, now fully re-equipped with Bell P-63’s, quietly ferried east in the months before the offensive. Their job was clear: sweep the skies, smash enemy airfields and columns, and make sure the Kwantung Army never recovered its balance. Share on screen. Map of Soviet Far Eastern fronts, arrows pushing into Manchuria. P-63 regiment icons along key axes. Typical Kingcobra missions began before the tank spearheads crossed the frontier. At first light, P-63's roared in ahead of the ground advance, using their speed at low altitude to surprise Japanese positions. In one representative action, a Kingcobra flight dropped down on a rail line just as a supply train tried to pull away toward the interior. The leader raked the locomotive with .50 caliber fire, then walked a few 37 mm shells into the boiler. The engine erupted in steam and shrapnel. Cars derailed like toys behind it. Other sorties struck airfields. Rows of parked aircraft, many of them outdated trainers or worn-out fighters, dragged back into service. The Kingcobras came in low, cannon shells, and heavy machine. Gunfire shredding fabric wings, puncturing fuel tanks, and setting entire dispersal areas ablaze. A-37, Memon round that could rip a fighter apart in the air, had no trouble smashing through hangars, control towers, and fuel dumps. Hound screen. Unit caption and placeholder for specific regiment and sortie statistics, period footage or photos of Far East airfields. Japanese air resistance was scattered and uncoordinated. Fuel shortages and the shock of the Soviet offensive meant many aircraft never got off the ground. When they did, the mismatch was brutal. Ki-43s, K-27s, and the odd zero-met compact. Fast climbing, P-63s attacking from above in disciplined boom and zoom passes. In those brief, violent meetings, rugged Kingcobras with armor and self-sealing tanks faced fragile opponents flown by under-trained crews. The results were rarely in doubt. By war's end, the Soviets had received on the order of 2 Salazan to 400 Kingcobras, and a significant share of those stood on Far Eastern airstrips in August 1945. In the short campaign against Japan, Soviet fighter losses in air-to-air combat were minimal, while Japanese aircraft, often destroyed on the ground, were wiped out in the hundreds across Manchuria, Korea, Sakhalin, and the Kurils. Strategically, Japanese air power in the region was already mortally weakened by years of blockade and attrition. Tactically, the arrival of the P-63 made that weakness terminal. Its 37mm nose cannon, designed for a very different war, became the perfect instrument for a short, one-sided campaign. A final, brutal coda to the age of the lightly built, agile fighter. Strip away the myths, and the Kingcobra's story comes down to a simple equation: metal, math, and method have to match the war you're actually fighting. On a neutral score sheet, the P-63 was never the best fighter of World War II, but against flimsy, late-war Japanese airframes and a pilot corps gutted by fuel shortages and rushed training, its particular mix of rugged construction and a heavy centerline cannon was devastating. Airframe, weapon, doctrine, and enemy reality all lined up, and that alignment, not raw performance numbers, drove the kill ratios. You see the same thinking in what came next. Early Cold War MiG-15s carried 37mm and 23mm guns, precisely to shred B-29s with a few hits, just as later missile fighters were built on the assumption that one well-placed shot would replace 100 bullet strikes. Behind it all stood logistics and industry. American factories and Lend-Lease allowed the USSR to field a niche killer like the P-63 in real numbers, while Japan lacked the fuel, aircraft, and time to adapt. For modern air forces, the lesson is stark. Don't design or train for the last war's romantic dogfights. Design for the specific enemies, environments, and kill chains you will actually face, because that is where wars are won or lost long before the first trigger is pulled.